The 3rd of October 1922. The autumn had settled upon East London with its customary damp, the gas lamps along Belgrave Road casting pools of amber on the wet pavement below. Leaves from the plane trees in Ensley Gardens had accumulated against the curbs, black and soft as old rags. The streets of Ilford, that fashionable suburb 9 miles east of Dalston, were all but deserted at that hour, the working families long since retired, their parlour windows dark, the coal fires banked low for the night. Among the last souls still moving through those quiet streets were a man and a woman, walking the familiar route from Ilford station toward their home at 41 Kensington Gardens. Percy Thompson, 31 years of age, a shipping clerk. Edith Thompson, 28, chief buyer for a wholesale millinery house in Aldersgate. They had attended the Criterion Theatre in Piccadilly Circus that evening, a performance of the Ben Travers farce known as The Dippers, accompanied by Edith's uncle and aunt, a Mr. and Mrs. J. Laxton. They had separated at Piccadilly Circus Underground Station at approximately 11 o'clock and caught the 11:30 train to Ilford. They walked together along Belgrave Road, between De Vere and Ensley Gardens. They would not reach their door. Before the clock struck 1, Percy Thompson would be dead, and the life that Edith Thompson had so carefully, ambitiously constructed would begin its irreversible unravelling. Edith Jessie Graydon was born on Christmas Day, 1893, at 97 Norfolk Road, in Dalston, in the East End of London. She was the first of the 5 children of William Eustace Graydon, a clerk with the Imperial Tobacco Company, and his wife Ethel Jessie, the daughter of a police constable. By all accounts, Edith was a happy and unusually capable child, bright in arithmetic, gifted at dancing and acting, alive to the world around her in a manner that her family found both endearing and, at times, slightly unnerving. She liked to perform, she liked to feel things deeply, and she liked other people to know it. After leaving school in 1909, she joined a firm of clothing manufacturers near Aldgate. 2 years later, in 1911, she was employed at Carlton and Pryor Wholesale Milliners, then operating in the Barbican and later in Aldersgate. She rose quickly and without apparent difficulty to the position of chief buyer, an exceptional achievement for a woman of her background and her years. And she made regular trips to Paris on behalf of the firm. Paris, with its fashions and its light, and its implication that life could be arranged more beautifully than convention suggested, confirmed something Edith already suspected about herself. She had met Percy Thompson in 1909 when she was 15, and he 18. Percy was, by all descriptions, a steady and sensible young man, a shipping clerk of careful habits and conventional aspirations. He wanted a house, a wife, a family, and the ordinary dignities that attended a man of his station. After a courtship of 6 years, they were married at St. Barnabas in Manor Park on the 15th of January 1916. There is a detail, remarked upon in the accounts that survive, that is difficult to set aside. On the morning of her wedding, it is said, Edith told members of her family that she did not wish to go through with it. By the time she reached the top of the aisle, she had composed herself into every appearance of an eager bride. The marriage proceeded. The house at 41 Kensington Gardens in Ilford was purchased in July of 1920. With both their careers flourishing, they were considered, by those who saw them from the outside, to be a perfectly comfortable couple. What those on the outside could not see was the degree to which Edith felt enclosed by that comfort. She earned more than her husband. She had contributed the greater part of the funds for their home. She read voraciously, romantic novels chiefly, and she carried within her an imagination that the routines of a suburban marriage were never quite large enough to contain. It was in the summer of 1920 that the shape of things began, quietly, to shift. In 1920, the Thompsons became reacquainted with Frederick Edward Francis Bywaters, who had been a school friend of Edith's younger brothers some years previously. Bywaters, born on the 27th of June 1902, was then 18 years of age, 8 years younger than Edith, and already enlisted in the Merchant Navy. He was, by all contemporary accounts, a handsome and impulsive young man whose stories of foreign ports and distant places stirred precisely the quality in Edith that her domestic life was insufficient to sustain. Percy Thompson, oblivious to what was forming between his wife and their young acquaintance, invited Bywaters to join them on holiday, together with Edith's sister, Avis, at Shanklin on the Isle of Wight. In June of 1921, upon their return, Percy invited Bywaters to lodge with them. It was a decision whose consequences he could not then have anticipated. Barely a month after the Isle of Wight holiday, Edith and Frederick Bywaters had begun an affair. It came to a head when a trivial domestic incident in the Thompsons' garden erupted into violence. Percy struck his wife and caused her to fall against furniture. Their sitting tenant, a Mrs. Lester, later noted the bruising in a statement to police. Bywaters intervened. Percy ordered him out of the house. He went. He did not go far. The affair continued in secret. Then, in September of 1921, Bywaters returned to sea aboard the RMS Maria. He was at sea for a year, and for a year Edith wrote to him. She wrote constantly, prolifically, at length, over 70 letters in total, amounting eventually to more than 55,000 words. She wrote of her daily life, her outings in London, her dissatisfaction with her marriage, her devotion to Frederick. She sent him press cuttings. She wrote of grinding a glass electric light bulb to shards and introducing the fragments into her husband's food. She wrote of administering poison. She wrote that she could not lose one husband when she knew of a woman who had shed 3. She wrote, on the 2nd of October 1922, the evening before the murder, urging her lover, in her own words, to be so jealous that he would do something desperate. Whether these passages represented literal intention or the extravagant grammar of a romantic imagination was a question that would, in a matter of weeks, fall to a jury to decide. The letters were kept. Frederick Bywaters kept all of them. The Maria docked in September of 1922. He and Edith were reunited. The affair resumed. On the 2nd of October, they met for a hurried lunch. On the evening of the 3rd, the last night of his leave, while the Thompsons attended the theatre, Bywaters spent the evening dining with Edith's own family. He left the Graydon household at around 11 o'clock. Into his coat pocket the blade of a double-edged knife 5.5 inches in length. He made his way to Belgrave Road. He waited. It was John Webber of 59 De Vere Gardens who first heard the sound. A strangled, piteous scream that reached him through the walls of his house and brought him out into the night. He dressed hurriedly and made his way toward Belgrave Road. He saw 2 women and a man moving quickly up the street. Further along, he made out a match being struck, its brief light revealing 2 figures close to a garden wall. He approached. He found a man propped against the brickwork, bleeding heavily, and beside him, a woman, her face, in the poor light, a mask of distress. Webber asked whether the man had taken a fall. "Don't touch him, don't touch him," the woman cried. Percy Thompson was dead within minutes of Webber's arrival. Edith had been shouting. Neighbours reported hearing a woman screaming, "Oh don't," repeatedly in the street, and police were summoned to the scene. By the time constables arrived on Belgrave Road, she had not composed herself. She was escorted home. She gave an initial account in which she described her husband as having been overcome by some kind of seizure. She said she had seen no attacker. She identified no one. At the mortuary in St. Mary's Church, the attending officers undressed the body of Percy Thompson and established rapidly that the injuries were not consistent with any medical episode. The wounds were those of a blade, delivered repeatedly. This was not accident or illness. This was murder. The following day, the 4th of October, Edith Thompson was brought to Ilford police station for further questioning. She maintained her account with some steadiness. What she did not yet know was that Frederick Bywaters was by that point already a suspect. Inspector Frank Hall had been making inquiries. The Thompsons' former lodger, the young merchant seaman, had been identified as a possible party to the matter within hours of the killing. Bywaters was arrested that evening. He was taken to Ilford police station and placed in an interrogation room. He denied any involvement in the murder. He described himself as a long-standing family friend of the Thompsons and offered an account of his movements the previous night. Then, on the 9th of October, police located, in the mud of a sewer in Seymour Gardens, approximately 5 minutes' walk from the scene, a blood-stained dagger. The blade was still smeared. Bywaters was later taken to retrieve it, having directed police to the location himself. The investigation had found what it needed. Post-mortem examination of the body of Percy Thompson confirmed that death had resulted from multiple stab wounds. The injuries were consistent with a blade of the dimensions and type recovered from the sewer drain in Seymour Gardens. The wound pattern indicated a violent and prolonged struggle. In the days following the murder, a box was discovered by police aboard Bywaters' vessel, the RMS Morea, moored at Tilbury, Essex. The box contained 62 letters and telegrams written by Edith Thompson to Frederick Bywaters, together with approximately 50 newspaper cuttings, a number of which related to cases of murder by poison, and a photograph of Edith Thompson. 3 letters from Bywaters to Edith were recovered from her place of employment at Carlton and Pryor. The letters constituted the most significant body of evidence assembled against Edith Thompson. The extant correspondence ran from November 1921 through to the end of September 1922, and covered in considerable detail the daily life of a London woman separated from her lover by the rhythms of his profession at sea. Amidst the domestic and romantic passages, investigators identified a series of references of grave concern. She described grinding an electric light bulb to fragments and introducing the glass into her husband's food, mixed into mashed potato. She described administering poison on a separate occasion. She enclosed cuttings about murders by poisoning. The letters ran in total to more than 55,000 words. The Crown later appointed Sir Bernard Spilsbury and Dr. John Webster, 2 of the foremost pathologists of the day, to conduct independent post-mortem analysis on the exhumed body of Percy Thompson. Both physicians concluded categorically that there was no trace of poison in the body and no evidence of ground glass. What the forensic record could not settle was the question of intent, whether the letters described acts actually committed or were the expressions of an overwrought imagination. That question, too, would pass to a jury. If you're finding this case as compelling as we are, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It truly helps us continue researching and sharing these forgotten stories from history. We also read every comment, so let us know your thoughts on this case below. Now, let's continue. On the 5th of October 1922, a day after Percy Thompson's death, both Edith Thompson and Frederick Bywaters were charged with willful murder and remanded in custody. At that first remand hearing, Edith still wore the same clothes in which she had attended the theatre, a brown coat with a mole fur collar and cuffs, a hat of the same fur, plain white gloves. She had to be assisted to and from the dock. Bywaters entered the court in a blue flannel suit, composed. Their trial was set for the following December. The trial of Frederick Bywaters and Edith Thompson opened at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, on the 6th of December, 1922. The presiding judge was Mr. Justice Shearman. For the Crown, the prosecution was led by the Solicitor General, Sir Thomas Inskip, assisted by Travis Humphreys. Bywaters was defended by Cecil Whiteley KC. Edith Thompson was represented by Sir Henry Curtis Bennet KC. The case had already consumed the press. Members of the public queued through the night for places in the gallery. Artists from Madame Tussauds were observed sketching the defendants for the Chamber of Horrors. One reporter remarked that the atmosphere recalled the days of the Roman Empire, when the Christians were brought before the lions. The defendants were, by that point, celebrities of the most particular and pitiless kind. The evidence against Bywaters was compelling and largely uncontested. He had led police to the murder weapon. He had been found in possession of a blood-stained coat. He had confessed to the killing, maintaining throughout that he had acted without Edith's knowledge or participation, and that his intention had been to confront Percy Thompson about granting a divorce, that the stabbing had occurred only after Percy threatened him, and the confrontation grew violent. He was consistent on every point concerning Edith. She made no suggestion to me, he stated. She did not know I intended to confront him. The case against Edith Thompson rested almost entirely upon the letters. Sir Henry Curtis Bennet urged her not to testify. The burden of proof lay with the Crown, he argued, and there was nothing that could be proved against her beyond her presence at the scene. She rejected his counsel. She wished to give evidence. She took the witness stand. It was a catastrophe. The prosecution used her own letters to contradict her, to tangle her account, to press her on passages she could not explain without admitting that she had sought to conceal her abortions from her husband. She repeatedly said, "I have no idea," in answer to questions about the meaning of her own words. The judge addressed the jury as gentlemen throughout, despite the presence of a woman among their number, and his animus toward Edith Thompson was apparent and extensively remarked upon at the time. He labelled her an adulterer and her letters insensate, silly affection. On the 11th of December, after 2 hours and 35 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned, guilty, both defendants. When the sentence was pronounced, Bywaters cried out, "The jury is wrong, that woman is not guilty." Edith Thompson became hysterical. She was taken to the cells. The shift in public sentiment was swift and almost total. Before the verdict, Thompson and Bywaters had been the subjects of sensationalist and largely hostile coverage in the press. Edith had been labelled the Messalina of Ilford. After the sentence, that hostility became something altogether more complicated. Nearly 1 million signatures were collected on a petition seeking reprieve. The campaign was organised, earnest, and ultimately futile. The appeals of both defendants were heard before the Lord Chief Justice, Mr. Justice Darling, and Mr. Justice Salter on the 21st of December 1922. They were dismissed. The Home Secretary, William Bridgeman, refused a reprieve for both. Bywaters wrote a further confession, yet again declaring Edith entirely innocent. It changed nothing. Edith spent the final days of her life in the condemned cell at Holloway Prison in a state that witnesses described as near hysteria, unable to eat, unable to compose herself, crying and screaming and collapsing at intervals. She was told of the fixed execution date only days before. The knowledge undid her entirely. At 9 o'clock in the morning of the 9th of January, 1923, Edith Thompson was carried to the gallows at Holloway Prison by 4 prison warders. She had been administered a heavy sedative by the prison governor and was barely conscious. She was strapped into a bosun's chair. A white hood was placed over her head and a noose around her neck. At the same moment, precisely half a mile away, at Pentonville Prison, Frederick Bywaters walked to the gallows, attended by the hangman, William Willis. He was, by all accounts, composed. His last words on record were a renewed declaration of Edith's innocence. Edith Thompson was 29 years of age. Frederick Bywaters was 20. The effect upon John Ellis, the hangman at Holloway, was profound. He resigned from his position the following year. Several prison officers who had been present at the execution took early retirement. Ellis grew increasingly distressed and began drinking heavily. He died by his own hand in 1931. The journalist James Douglas, writing for the Sunday Express in January of 1923, stated that he considered the hanging of Edith Thompson to be a miscarriage of both mercy and justice, and set out 8 points upon which, in his judgment, the charge of wilful murder could not be sustained against her. Decades later, Edgar Lustgarten wrote that the Thompson verdict was now recognized as bad, and the trial from which it sprang stands out as an example of the evils that may flow from an attitude of mind. Edith Thompson's body was buried initially within the walls of Holloway Prison, as was customary for executed persons. In 1970, when Holloway underwent extensive rebuilding, her remains, along with those of Stillo Christofi, Amelia Satch, and Annie Walters, were exhumed and reburied in a single grave at Brookwood Cemetery in Surrey. The grave remained unmarked for over 2 decades. In November of 1993, a grey granite memorial was placed on plot 117 and formally consecrated by the Reverend Barry Arscott of St. Barnabas in Manor Park, the very church in which Edith had been married. The epitaph reads, "Sleep on, beloved." Her death was a legal formality. Her mother, Ethel Graydon, had requested repeatedly to be told where her daughter's grave was, to be allowed to visit, or at least to know. The request was always denied. Ethel Graydon died in 1938. Her dying wish was that Edith should one day be buried with her and her husband. It would take 80 years for that wish to be acted upon. On the 22nd of November, 2018, Edith Thompson's remains were exhumed from Brookwood Cemetery and formally reinterred in the City of London Cemetery. In the same grave as her mother and father, dozens gathered to pay their respects. In January of 2023, a century after her execution, the Secretary of State for Justice referred an application for a posthumous pardon, submitted on behalf of Edith Thompson's heir and executor, Rene Weiss, to the Criminal Cases Review Commission as a potential miscarriage of justice. Percy Thompson's remains rest at the City of London Cemetery. Frederick Bywaters lies still in an unmarked grave within the walls of HMP Pentonville, where he was buried on the day of his execution. No exhumation order has ever been granted for him. The grey granite stone of the City of London Cemetery stands quietly now, in the manner of all such memorials, weathered a little, visited sometimes by strangers who stopped to read a name and thought they understood, and by others who came knowing the story and found that knowing it had not prepared them for the smallness of the stone or for the silence around it.